Forget everything you think you know about the Peaky Blinders. I'm serious. The slick suits, the dramatic slow-motion walks, the brooding Cillian Murphy stare. The BBC show is incredible television, but it barely scratches the surface of what actually happened on the streets of Birmingham. Because the real Peaky Blinders didn't just have razor blades in their caps. They had women who could fight harder than most men. They recruited children as young as 10 years old, and they waged a brutal turf war that didn't last a few dramatic seasons. It lasted 4 decades, 40 years of blood, blades, and chaos in the industrial heartland of England. And today, I'm going to tell you the full story, because the truth is somehow far more terrifying than anything a screenwriter could dream up. To understand the real Peaky Blinders, you first have to understand what Birmingham was like in the 1880s and 1890s. This was not a glamorous city. This was one of the most overcrowded, polluted, and poverty-stricken places in the entire British Empire. We're talking about a city where entire families lived in single rooms in back-to-back houses with no running water, where children worked in factories by the age of 8, where life expectancy in some neighbourhoods was barely 40 years. The slums of Small Heath, Bordesley, Cheapside, and Digbeth were breeding grounds for desperation, and desperation breeds crime. The gang that would become known as the Peaky Blinders emerged from this misery in the late 1880s. And right away, I need to address the name. The popular myth is that they sewed razor blades into the peaks of their flat caps and used them to slash enemies across the forehead, blinding them with their own blood. It's a fantastic image. It's also probably not true, at least not literally. Disposable razor blades weren't widely available in Birmingham until the early 1900s. Most historians now believe the name referred to the way the gang wore their peaked caps, pulled down low over their eyes, making them look menacing and making it harder for witnesses to identify them. The word blinder in Birmingham slang meant someone who looked striking or impressive. So Peaky Blinders roughly translates to sharp-dressed guys in peaked caps. But don't let that less dramatic origin fool you. What they lacked in sewn-in razor blades, they more than made up for with actual razors, knives, metal-tipped boots, belt buckles filed to a point, and custom-made weapons that would make your stomach turn. The earliest recorded references to the Peaky Blinders appear in newspaper reports from 1890. The Birmingham Daily Post and the Birmingham Mail started running stories about a loosely organized gang of young men terrorizing the streets. They weren't a single unified organization like in the TV show. They were more like a collection of neighborhood crews who shared a name, a dress code, and a complete disregard for human life. Now here's where the real story starts to diverge dramatically from the television version. In the show, women exist mostly in relation to the male characters. Polly Gray is brilliant, but she's still operating within Tommy's world. In reality, women weren't supporting players. They were active, violent, and feared members of the gangs in their own right. Court records from the 1890s and early 1900s are filled with cases of women associated with the Peaky Blinders being arrested for violent assault, robbery, and weapons possession. These weren't women who stood on the sidelines. A woman identified in the press only as Mary the Slasher was reported to have attacked a rival gang member's wife with a broken bottle in 1897. Another woman was convicted of kicking a man nearly to death with steel-tipped boots during a street fight in Small Heath. The magistrates at the time were often more horrified by the women's violence than the men's, not because it was worse, but because Victorian society simply could not comprehend women behaving this way. Judges would give speeches from the bench about the collapse of femininity while sentencing these women, completely missing the point that poverty and survival don't care about your gender norms. And then there were the children. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the real Peaky Blinders, and it's something the show has never really addressed. The gangs actively recruited boys as young as 10 and 11 years old. These weren't teenagers, these were children. They were used as lookouts, as pickpockets, as messengers, and eventually as fighters. A court case from 1893 describes a 12-year-old boy being arrested for slashing a man with a razor during a robbery. 12 years old. The boy told the magistrate he'd been with the gang for 2 years, meaning he was recruited at 10. The gangs offered these children something their families couldn't: money, food, protection, and a sense of belonging. It was predatory and calculated, and it created a self-perpetuating cycle of violence that would last for generations. By the mid-1890s, the Peaky Blinders and their associated crews had established control over illegal gambling, protection rackets, and robbery across large sections of Birmingham. And that's when the real war started. The Peaky Blinders' most famous rivalry was with a gang called the Sloggers, also known as the Birmingham Boys, based out of the Cheapside area. The Sloggers were primarily involved in illegal gambling at racecourses, and they did not appreciate the Peaky Blinders moving into their territory. What followed was not a brief, dramatic conflict. It was a grinding, relentless 40-year war that ebbed and flowed but never truly stopped. In 1897, there was a massive street battle between the two gangs that left dozens injured and made national headlines. Witnesses described hundreds of young men fighting with knives, razors, bricks, and iron bars in broad daylight. Police were initially afraid to intervene because they were simply outnumbered. When reinforcements arrived, they found the streets literally stained with blood. But here's what made this turf war different from what you see on television. There was no grand strategy. There was no genius criminal mastermind playing four-dimensional chess. It was chaotic, personal, and incredibly petty. Men were stabbed over card games. Women were attacked for being seen talking to someone from the wrong street. Entire families were targeted because of a grudge that started over a stolen horse 3 years earlier. The violence was constant, low-level, and woven into the fabric of daily life in these neighborhoods. The conflict evolved over the decades. By the 1910s and 1920s, the original Peaky Blinders had largely aged out or been imprisoned, but the name lived on. New leaders emerged. The gangs professionalized somewhat, moving more heavily into organized protection rackets at racecourses across England. This is the era that the TV show draws from most heavily, particularly the real figure of Billy Kimber, who controlled a massive racing fraud operation. But even then, the show sanitizes the reality. The real racecourse wars involved mass brawls at public events, innocent bystanders being slashed, and a level of police corruption that would be almost comical if it weren't so destructive. The turf wars didn't truly begin to wind down until the late 1930s, and even then it was less about any decisive victory, and more about the approach of World War II giving young men something else to do with their aggression. 40 years. That's longer than most countries' actual wars. Now, I want to be fair to the television show, because it does get some things right. The atmosphere of post-World War I Birmingham, the sense of trauma and displacement, the uneasy relationship between the working class and the authorities, all of that is grounded in real history. The show captures the emotional truth even when it changes the facts. But the differences are significant. Tommy Shelby is a fiction. There was no single charismatic leader who unified the Peaky Blinders into a disciplined criminal empire. The real gang was messy, fractured, and often self-destructive. Members regularly betrayed each other. Leadership changed constantly, often through violence rather than strategy. The real Peaky Blinders weren't criminal geniuses. They were desperate people in a desperate city doing desperate things. The show also dramatically compresses the timeline. It places the Peaky Blinders primarily in the 1920s and 1930s, but the real gang was most active in the 1890s and 1900s. By the time Tommy Shelby is supposedly running Birmingham, the actual Peaky Blinders were already a fading memory, being replaced by newer, different criminal organizations. And perhaps most importantly, the show glamorizes the violence. It makes it cinematic and cool. The reality was ugly. People didn't die dramatically in slow motion with Nick Cave playing in the background. They bled out in gutters, they lost eyes, they were disfigured for life. The victims were overwhelmingly other poor people, not wealthy rivals or corrupt politicians. The legacy of the Peaky Blinders is complicated. For decades, Birmingham wanted nothing to do with this history. It was a source of shame, a reminder of poverty and violence that the city was trying to move past. Old residents of Small Heath and Bordersley would lower their voices when talking about the gangs, if they talked about them at all. Then the TV show arrived in 2013 and everything changed. Suddenly, the Peaky Blinders were cool. Tourism boomed. You can now take Peaky Blinders walking tours through Birmingham. There are Peaky Blinders-themed bars and restaurants. The city that once tried to bury this history now celebrates it, or at least celebrates the fictionalized version of it. But historians and long-time residents have mixed feelings about this. Because when you turn real suffering into entertainment, you risk erasing the people who actually lived through it. The children who were recruited into violence at 10 years old. The women who fought not because they were empowered, but because they had no other choice. The families torn apart by feuds that lasted longer than lifetimes. The real Peaky Blinders weren't anti-heroes. They weren't lovable rogues. They were a product of a society that abandoned its most vulnerable people and then acted shocked when those people turned to violence. And that's a story that's not just about 1890s Birmingham. It's about every city, in every era, that lets poverty and inequality fester until something terrible grows out of it. So the next time you watch the show and think Tommy Shelby is intimidating, just remember that the real streets of Birmingham produced something far more frightening. Not a single brilliant villain, but an entire ecosystem of violence that swallowed men, women and children whole and didn't let go for 4 decades. If this video taught you something new about the real Peaky Blinders, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love history. Subscribe if you haven't already, because I cover stories like this every week. The real history hiding behind the fiction we all love. And drop a comment below telling me what surprised you most. Was it the women fighters, the child soldiers, the 40-year war? I read every single comment and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.